Political elite and warmongers are carelessly fomenting fear and tensions between nuclear powers.
Okay, as director of national intelligence, I'm pretty sure you are a political elite, Tulsi, but whatever. It's Thursday, June 12th. I'm Jane Coaston, and this is What a Day, the show that sends its best to Beach Boys great Brian Wilson, who has passed away at the age of 82. If you listen to God Only Knows on high-quality headphones, you will ascend to a higher plane of existence. On today's show, President Donald Trump says he's restoring the names of Confederate generals to military bases. He's not. And Director of National Intelligence Tulsi Gabbard warns of a nuclear holocaust. But let's start with guns. A lot has been happening pretty much everywhere. So you may have missed the Supreme Court making 3 very important decisions on gun policy. Well, technically, the court made one very important decision, but decided not to make 2 more. Let me explain. Last week, the Supreme Court ruled against a $10 billion lawsuit from Mexico against American gun manufacturers. The Mexican government had alleged that U.S. gun companies were fueling cartel violence south of the border. But in a unanimous opinion, liberal Justice Elena Kagan wrote that the lawsuit didn't reach the burden required by a 2005 law. The Protection of Lawful Commerce in Arms Act protects gun manufacturers from lawsuits brought because of misuse of their products. But the court declined to take up 2 other gun cases, one challenging Maryland's ban on semi-automatic weapons, the other challenging Rhode Island's ban on high-capacity magazines. This is all happening in the context of President Trump's return to the Oval Office. And back in 2017, gun rights advocates were thrilled to see him in the White House. But then, and now, Trump's gun policy bona fides are complicated. See, no one was more excited to go and speak at the National Rifle Association's annual convention than Trump, except for this year, for some reason. And his administration has lifted a bunch of Biden-era gun control measures. But after the Las Vegas mass shooting in 2017, Trump ordered a ban on bump stocks. Bump stocks allow semi-automatic weapons to fire faster. The ban was ruled unconstitutional by the Supreme Court last year. And after mass shootings in 2019, he voiced support for background check legislation. All of this has made both gun control advocates and gun rights supporters very cautious when it comes to dealing with Trump. So, to talk more about the Supreme Court's decisions and lack of decisions, and what this means for gun policy, I had to talk to Stephen Gutowski. He runs The Reload, a news outlet dedicated to firearms and the gun debate. Stephen, welcome to What a Day.
Hey, thank you for having me.
So, tell me about the Supreme Court case filed by the Mexican government. What were the arguments on both sides, and what did the court decide with its ruling?
Sure. This is a case over Mexico's claim that Smith & Wesson and other American gun manufacturers ought to be held liable for the criminal use of their products by cartels and other criminals in Mexico. And so they wanted to try and hold them accountable for about $10 billion of liability claims, whereas the American gun companies argued that the connections Mexico had tried to draw between the violence in Mexico and their business practices were too far disconnected, certainly, from the claimed harm, and that they weren't allowed to file this sort of lawsuit under American federal law because Congress passed a bill called the Protection of Lawful Commerce in Arms Act back in 2005 that doesn't allow lawsuits over the criminal misuse of firearms against firearms companies unless you can find some sort of violation by the gun companies that connect them to that crime. And in the end, the Supreme Court ruled that Mexico had not found that underlying offense by the gun companies here to make the connection to hold the companies liable for these murders that happen in Mexico.
So it's interesting because you pointed out that there is that 2005 law, but there was a more recent $73 million settlement in Connecticut from Remington Arms, which made the rifle used in the Sandy Hook Elementary School shooting. The victim's family sued Remington, saying it irresponsibly marketed their guns in violation of state consumer laws. The families got a big settlement, and I think a lot of people thought that that might be a roadmap to future cases. So what's the disconnect there?
Yeah, and I would say that that settlement helped inspire a raft of new cases under the same concept of trying to pierce this veil of protection from that federal law, because there are ways to still sue gun companies under this law, even though, obviously critics of the law think it's too protective. And the big difference here is that the Supreme Court, first of all, it's the first time they've ruled on it. And they simply didn't see enough specific evidence of aiding and abetting. That's what Mexico tried to claim the gun companies were doing for cartel members or illicit firearms traffickers. For instance, they targeted what they called military-style firearms, specifically AR-15s, and then also certain models that had what Mexico claimed were particularly attractive features for cartel members. They claimed that Colt made a gun that had, Mexican icons on it, like historical figures that they said were attractive to cartel members, and perhaps they're doing it on purpose to try and boost sales in that way. But there was never any sort of specific evidence of breaking any of the American firearms laws. And the Supreme Court just didn't think that there was enough there, I suppose. Mm-hmm. So they didn't say, this kind of lawsuit could never succeed. They said Mexico's attempt at it didn't work.
We also saw the High Court turn away 2 cases regarding state gun laws. One was about Maryland's ban on assault rifles and semi-automatic rifles like AR-15s. The other was about Rhode Island's restrictions on high-capacity magazines. So what does this tell us about where the court stands on the issue of assault style or so-called assault weapons bans?
It is interesting to think what exactly it tells us, because you had 3 justices who wanted to take up this case. They relisted this case 15 times, which is very unusual. It means they reconsidered it 15 weeks in a row and ultimately denied it. And the most interesting thing that happened is Justice Brett Kavanaugh wrote this statement that said he strongly believes that the lower court was wrong to uphold this assault weapons ban, and that the assault weapons bans generally are not allowed under the Second Amendment. But he had a nod towards there are other cases going through the court, and that'll give, if we let the lower courts percolate a little bit longer, maybe it'll better inform our ultimate decision on this. And then he gave a very specific time frame, saying that in 1 or 2 terms that he expects that they will take up a case. So they very easily could have addressed this and didn't. And so there's a lot of little clues you could look at and maybe say they're tipping their hand, and eventually they will strike down an AR-15 ban, but there's still some open questions.
Now, we've talked about this before. President Trump, during his first term, was very weird on gun issues. Just giving an example, after the horrifying Las Vegas mass shooting, he decided that we're going to ban bump stocks. And even ATF was saying, I don't know if we can do that. And that actually went to the Supreme Court, where it turns out you could not do that. So beyond these recent Supreme Court decisions, and knowing what we saw in the first term of President Trump, how can we expect gun policy to change under Trump's second term?
If you look at his history on gun policy, a lot of his first term was marked by some movement that gun rights activists would like, but not a lot. And there wasn't that much administrative movement on it either. But he was rhetorically rather pro-gun until you saw major mass shootings happening. The aftermath of major mass shootings are when Donald Trump has a tendency to come out and at least flirt with support for more restrictive gun policies, whether through legislation or, as in the bump stock ban case, through administrative action. We haven't had a major mass shooting since he's been president, thankfully. To this point, certainly nothing like, Sandy Hook or the Las Vegas shooting. And so it'll be interesting to see how he reacts to that. But this time around, I would say that at least the people he's put in place lower down the chain who oversee, the administrative side of gun policy are being a bit more aggressive to meet the goals of a lot of the gun rights groups that had supported Donald Trump during the campaign. So, you've seen things like the ATF reverse itself on a number of Biden-era policies, like the zero tolerance policy for gun dealers. You've seen them institute a new rights restoration process that's kind of also included Trump's prominent supporters and friends. Mel Gibson getting his gun rights back for a domestic violence incident was among the first there. But they've started to change their positions in different court cases as well to try and match what gun rights activists have been arguing. So I think there's been a bit more actual policy movement this time around than there was the first time, but he hasn't come to that test of what he does in the aftermath of a major mass shooting.
Stephen, thank you so much for joining me.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me.
Hey, subscribe to our channel. It takes just a second. It's a great way to support us and help people find our content, like this podcast that you're watching. Thank you. What Today is brought to you by ZBiotics Pre-Alcohol. Let's face it, after a night with drinks, I don't bounce back the next day the way I did like 10 years ago. I have to make a choice. I can either have a great night or a great next day. That is, until I found pre-alcohol. ZBiotics Pre-Alcohol Probiotic Drink is the world's first genetically engineered probiotic. It was invented by PhD scientists to tackle rough mornings after drinking. Here's how it works. When you drink, alcohol gets converted into a toxic byproduct in the gut. It's a buildup of this byproduct, not dehydration, that's to blame for rough days after drinking. Pre-alcohol produces an enzyme to break this byproduct down. Just remember to make pre-alcohol your first drink of the night, drink responsibly, and you'll feel your best tomorrow. I won't lie, I was a little on the fence with pre-alcohol initially. But then, after trying it and being able to go for a run the next day and feel totally normal, I'm a believer. Summer is here, which means more opportunities to celebrate the warm weather. Before that backyard barbecue brew, glass of Pinot watching the sunset at the beach, or a cocktail by the campfire, don't forget your ZBiotics Pre-Alcohol. Drink one before drinking and wake up feeling great and ready to take on the next day and all that summer has to offer. Go to zbiotics.com/WAD to learn more and get 15% off your first order when you use code WAD at checkout. ZBiotics is backed with a 100% money-back guarantee. So if you're unsatisfied for any reason, they'll refund your money, no questions asked. Remember to head to zbiotics.com/WAD and use the code WAD at checkout for 15% off.
Headline. So this was the first step, the framework by which we will then approach and discuss growing trade. But first we had to get sort of the negativity out, and now we can go forward to try to do positive trade, growing trade, and beneficial to both China and to the United States of America.
Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick told reporters late Tuesday evening that the U.S. and China reached a trade agreement. From the outside, it sounds pretty similar to one both countries outlined back in May. President Trump was more definitive, writing on Truth Social Wednesday morning that the deal was done. But, key detail, it needs final approval from both Trump and Chinese President Xi Jinping. Since reaching a trade truce in May, both countries have accused each other of straying from its terms. China continued to restrict rare earth mineral and magnet exports to the U.S., and Trump announced a crackdown on Chinese student visas. The latest details are still scant, but we do know that the U.S. would still impose a 55% tariff on Chinese imports, while China would maintain a 10% tariff on U.S. goods. President Trump's Truth Social post noted that the U.S. will continue to allow Chinese students to study at American colleges and universities. He added that Chinese students in American universities have, quote, always been good with me. Sure.
A single nuclear weapon today could kill millions in just minutes. Just one of these nuclear bombs would vaporize everything at its core. People, buildings, life itself.
Fun! Director of National Intelligence Tulsi Gabbard posted an alarming video on Twitter Tuesday, warning Americans about the threat of a nuclear holocaust. The 3-minute video shows footage of Gabbard in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the Japanese cities the U.S. dropped bombs on during World War II. The timing for Gabbard's short-form cinema drop is, complex. The Trump administration is in the midst of negotiating a nuclear weapons deal with Iran. In late March, President Trump threatened to attack Iran if a deal can't be made. On Wednesday, Iranian Defense Minister Aziz Nazirzadeh said that if the U.S. attacked, Iran would retaliate by striking U.S. military bases. By the look of it, Gabbard's video takes that threat seriously. It shows the Golden Gate Bridge blown apart during a hypothetical nuclear attack.
This isn't some made-up science fiction story. This is the reality of what's at stake, what we are facing now. Because as we stand here today, closer to the brink of nuclear annihilation than ever before, political elite and warmongers are carelessly fomenting fear and tensions between nuclear powers.
Okay, as director of national intelligence, I'm pretty sure you are a political elite, Tulsi, but whatever. Anyway, in response to the video, Republican Senator John Kennedy of Louisiana told Jewish Insider that Gabbard, quote, obviously needed to change her meds. And this is from the senator who confirmed her for her position as National Intelligence Director, by the way.
Hundreds of CDC employees learned that they are being reinstated. That's according to a union representing workers, which says notices went out to around 460 laid-off workers at the Atlanta-based agency today.
That's NBC affiliate WXIA in Atlanta reporting that Health and Human Services Secretary Robert F. Kennedy Jr. is walking back some of the staff cuts he's made since he was sworn in this February. If you don't recall, those cuts to the department were big. Around 10,000 employees were given layoff notices in April. 2,400 of those were from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. RFK Jr. did say, though, that they'd hire some folks back. Well, on Wednesday, he was true to his word on this one singular topic for 460 employees of the CDC. An HHS spokesperson confirmed that more than 200 of the reinstated employees work in the National Center for HIV, viral hepatitis, sexually transmitted disease, and tuberculosis prevention. Another 158 came from the National Center for Environmental Health, places where you totally would have wanted fewer people around to fight disease. To be fair, RFK Jr.'s agency has been rehiring some employees over the past few months, but Wednesday's binge was the biggest, at just 460 out of 10,000. The White House this week broke ground, literally. I'm talking about the president zhuzhing up the north and south lawns and revamping the Rose Garden by paving over some of it. Hey, we knew this was coming, didn't we? Here's President Trump back in March talking to Fox News.
Are you paving over the grass here?
What was happening is that's supposed to have events. Every event you have, it's soaking wet.
Yeah.
It's soaking wet, and people can't. And the women with the high heels, it's just too much.
That's who did the Kavanaugh.
That's what we did.
Thing.
That's right.
Amy Coney Barrett.
And the grass it doesn't work, and we have a gorgeous stone and everything else.
Okay.
But we use it for press conferences, and it doesn't work because the people fall into the wet.
The roses stay. The grass goes.
The roses stay. No, it's a rose garden.
Gotta make sure the ladies can wear heels on the White House lawn. Top priority. Write that down. Anyway, on Monday, reporters snapped pics of President Trump back in his element, overlooking a construction project in the garden. Some grass looked dug up, and there are some portions missing along a limestone border. First Lady Melania Trump had the border put in 2020. A White House official who spoke to the Associated Press on the condition of anonymity said National Park Service employees started the project Monday. It's set to be completed in about 2 months. And that's the news. One more thing. In case you missed it, President Trump went to Fort Bragg in North Carolina this week for a little pep rally that seemed less about celebrating the 250th anniversary of the founding of the Army and more about yelling about Joe Biden and how terrible Los Angeles is. But he did say something interesting that was actually about the Army. It was about military bases.
Every inch of this base is steeped in the legacy of those warriors who have said with pride, "Sir, I trained at Fort Bragg, sir." That was pretty cool. And that is why we restored the historic name of this very, very special place. I don't know if it could be the same place. Fort Bragg is in, that's the name. And Fort Bragg, it shall always remain. That's never going to be happening again.
Yes, Donald Trump has decided that we are renaming a bunch of military bases again, but to bring back the names of Confederate military figures who fought against the United States in the service of slavery and lost. Don't forget that part. But funnily enough, that's not what's actually happening. Because while the names might be the same or similar, the people aren't. And it's Trump's own fault. Sort of. See, back in 2020, Congress overrode a veto from then President Trump to pass a military budget that included a little provision that banned the use of Confederate names for American military installations. So yes, Fort Bragg will be named Fort Bragg again, but it won't be for Braxton Bragg, Confederate general. It'll be for Private First Class Roland L. Bragg, who stole a German ambulance to save a fellow soldier's life during the Second World War and won a Silver Star and Purple Heart. And Fort Lee won't be named for Confederate general and noted loser Robert E. Lee. Rather, it'll be named for Private Fitz Lee, a black soldier who won a Medal of Honor for his bravery rescuing his fellow soldiers during the Spanish-American War. In fact, All of the bases Trump thinks he's returning to names honoring Confederate military figures are going to be named after people who had nothing to do with the Confederacy and just happened to have the same last names. Flawless victory, Mr. Trump. As a noted lib, I have never enjoyed being owned by the President of the United States more. That's all for today. If you like the show, make sure you subscribe, leave a review, contemplate Donald Trump's intense love of the musical Cats, and tell your friends to listen. And if you're into reading, and not just about how Donald Trump is an elderly Manhattanite who loves Andrew Lloyd Webber musicals, you know, the non-woke kind of musical, and gold crown molding on everything, like me. What a Day is also a nightly newsletter. Check it out and subscribe at crooked.com/subscribe. I'm Jane Coaston, and someone asked the president his thoughts on Starlight Express.